The Harry Potter movies, like any book-to-film adaptation, had to cut a decent amount of the original story down in order to make it presentable for the silver screen. But sometimes this cutting can go a bit overboard, and there's no example more perfect than this scene in the Sorcerer's Stone movie. You see, although this scene is literally 2 minutes in length, it corresponds to an entire chapter in the Harry Potter book. Because of this section being massively condensed, we miss out on awesome parts of the story, like Harry's second Quidditch match, Ron and Neville's full-on fist fight with Draco, Crabbe, and Goyle, and most importantly, we miss Harry doing recon work on his Nimbus 2000 and overhearing a conversation between Snape and Quirrell in the Forbidden Forest. My name is Gibby, and welcome back to episode 12 of Movies vs. Manuscripts, Harry Potter Edition. This is a show where I analyze the Harry Potter movies and compare them to J.K. Rowling's iconic book series, and find every single difference, scene by scene. Today, we are resuming our journey through Harry's first school year as Hermione gets back from Christmas break and the trio finally discover who Nicholas Flamel is. However, in the book, these events are incredibly different, and not only that, but there are massive chunks of the story that are just straight up removed. So today, let's relive these amazing moments in the wizarding world and set the record straight on how these chapters really went down. Before we do, however, I wanted to give a shout out to this commenter. Each week, I'll be featuring one of my favorite comments from a previous episode, so once you're done with this video, be sure to comment your thoughts down below. As always, I'll be tracking all the differences across 4 major categories: characters, timeline, location, and plot. But before we get to the changes, we need to refresh our memory on what happens during this brief scene in the movie. Picking up from where we left off last week, with Harry talking to Dumbledore about the Mirror of Erised, we see a transition scene with Harry taking Hedwig out for a midday flight during the holiday break, and then the movie cuts to the trio in the library as Hermione slams down a massive book. She tells the boys that she feels stupid, as the answer has been in front of her all along, and she turns to a page in the book that has Nicholas Flamel's name and information. The boys are shocked at this discovery, and they learn that Flamel is known for his creation of the Philosopher's, or Sorcerer's, Stone, and immediately they know that that is what Fluffy is guarding in the castle. And that is where the scene ends for this week. I know, that literally took just a few seconds, and the scene feels even shorter in the movie, as most of it is just them pausing and looking into each other's eyes. But crazily enough, this scene packs a punch, as it exists to summarize the entirety of chapter 13 in the Philosopher's Stone book. Let's start things off by covering our character, timeline, and location changes for this week. First, for characters, as you can imagine, we are missing a massive amount of people. And like I mentioned last week, I really can't go through and name all of the students and professors that are in every single chapter. But there is one person who is primarily excluded from the scene we do get in the movie, and that is Perenelle Flamel, Nicholas's wife. She gets a brief mention in the book where they see Flamel's name, and that's about it. Like I said, there's lots of other characters in this chapter, like Draco and his goons, some professors, Hagrid, and more, but they are just about in every chapter. As for timeline, there really isn't much to discuss, other than the fact that they obviously crunched an entire chapter, which essentially is weeks worth of content, into just a 2-minute scene. Similarly to my previous Harry Potter episodes, it isn't so much that this didn't happen, as we know Harry is progressing through the school year in the movie. It's more so that the book just does a good job summarizing the in-between parts and providing context and world building for the reader, which we really don't get in the film format. Lastly, for these first 3 categories, we have location, and this week we are missing 2 primary locations, the Forbidden Forest and the Quidditch pitch, as there's an entire Quidditch game removed from the movie. The Forbidden Forest plays a larger role in the plot changes, so I'll save an explanation for that when we get to that change. Before we jump into the changes, I just want to remind you that I can't go into every single line spoken in these chapters, as that would take way too long. So if you're looking to revisit the world of Harry Potter word for word, check out the link in my description for a free trial on Audible, which comes with 1 free audiobook. It supports the channel, and you can follow along with me each week. Alright, now let's head into the plot changes. As always, let's begin with a summary of what we learn at the beginning of the chapter. Per usual, J.K. Rowling starts off by giving us a description of the things that have occurred in between the previous chapter and this one, as typically a couple weeks or so have passed in between events. From Harry's perspective, we get valuable context that helps build out the world and fill us in on more details, which the movie usually removes. So here's a rundown of everything we miss from the beginning of this chapter. First, Harry had a hard time forgetting the image of his parents. Although he held true to his promise to Dumbledore to not go searching for the Mirror of Erised again, he couldn't get their faces out of his head. We learn that he began having a recurring nightmare of seeing his parents disappear in a flash of green light while a high-pitched voice cackled with laughter. Of course, as we know, that's the night that Voldemort killed his parents. Second, once Hermione returned from her holiday break, she was shocked and appalled to hear of Harry's close call in the restricted section, but was also disappointed that he didn't even find out who Nicholas Flamel was. However, as we'll find out in a bit, he does have a breakthrough in that regard that the movie completely omits. Lastly, we learn that Harry was struggling in school and finding it hard to research Flamel's name, which the trio had been doing ever since school started back up. This was due to the insanely packed schedule he had with Quidditch practice, as Wood was working them twice as hard. And speaking of Quidditch, let's dive into our larger changes now, as this chapter pretty much revolves around the Gryffindor's game against Hufflepuff. This is a massive plot point in the books for one very specific reason, which is that Snape was the referee for the match. Of course, at this point, the trio believes that Snape is after whatever is hidden in the castle, and on top of that, they still believe Snape tried to kill Harry during his last Quidditch match. So after Harry learns that Snape is the referee during an awfully muddy practice with the Gryffindor team, he darts off to the Gryffindor common room to alert Ron and Hermione of this new development. They're curious as to why Snape, who has never refereed a Quidditch match in his life, suddenly wants to be involved in the game, and they believe it is because he's going to finish the job on Harry. Ron and Hermione encourage Harry to sit out of the game, telling him to fake being sick or break his leg on purpose to avoid dying during the game, but Harry is firm that he must play. This is a critical game for Gryffindor, because if they beat Hufflepuff, they'll pull ahead of Slytherin in the race for the House Cup, which hasn't been done in 7 years. Now let's press pause on this Quidditch match part of things and move on to the next thing that happens in this chapter, and the next plot change. Don't worry, we'll cover the full game later, but for now let's discuss yet another change that relates to our favorite fourth member of the Golden Trio, Neville. This moment is actually pretty crucial, as it foreshadows his later involvement at the end of the school year, and it sets up one of the biggest plot points for this chapter, which is the full-on brawl between the Slytherins and the Gryffindors. But we'll get to that fight later. For now, here's what happens. After Ron, Harry, and Hermione finish talking about the Quidditch game, they suddenly see Neville hop through the portrait hole into the common room, as his legs are tightly stuck together with what is obviously the leg-locking curse. As everyone is laughing, Hermione quickly performs the counter curse to get his legs unstuck, and they ask him what happened. As you probably guessed, this cruel prank was the doing of our favorite school bully, Malfoy. Neville tells them what happened, and Hermione encourages him to tell McGonagall, but Neville says he doesn't want any more trouble with Malfoy, and that he isn't brave enough to be in Gryffindor, which Malfoy has told him repeatedly. Harry then comforts Neville by giving him his last chocolate frog from Hermione's Christmas gift to him, and tells Neville that he's worth 12 of Malfoy. He tells him that the Sorting Hat put him in Gryffindor and put Malfoy in stinking Slytherin. Neville, who's now feeling a bit better, tells the trio that he's going to bed, and then gives Harry the collecting card from the chocolate frog, telling Harry to keep it since he knows that he collects them. And this segues perfectly into our next change for the movie, which is that Harry is the one who finds out who Nicholas Flamel is, not Hermione. The movie sneaks this in here in a way that somewhat aligns with the plot, but not entirely. Finding out who Flamel is one of the biggest plot points in the entire book and movie, so taking the credit away from Harry feels a bit much for me. Here's what really happens. If you've been watching this Harry Potter series on my channel all the way through, you might remember the episode when Ron and Harry meet on the Hogwarts Express. Well, while they're eating candy in their compartment, Harry tries his first chocolate frog and gets Dumbledore as his collecting card. In the book, we learn what else the card says, whereas the movie leaves it to just showing a face and a name on the card. This is a crucial bit of information, as keen-eyed readers will pick this up when they hear the name Flamel later on in the book, as Nicholas Flamel's name originally shows up for the first time on Dumbledore's chocolate frog card in the book. And that is precisely what happens here. As Harry takes the collecting card from Neville, he is sad when he sees he got yet another Dumbledore, as he is one of the most common cards. But then his words are cut short as he shockingly reads the card once again and sees that amongst Dumbledore's notable achievements, the card notes his work on alchemy with his partner, Nicholas Flamel. This is a massive breakthrough for our trio. But in the movie, they shorten this revelation down to a brief 2-minute scene, where Hermione, of course, gets the credit. Now, I did mention that the movie sort of plays off of what happens in the book, and this is how. In the movie, we see a brief scene of them studying in the library, and Hermione slams down a massive book, telling them that she found Flamel. In the book, they're still in the common room, and after Harry shares his revelation of who Flamel is, it triggers a memory in Hermione, and she tells them to stay put as she goes and gets something. As you might have guessed, she brings back a massive book that she checked out for a little bit of light reading and shows it to the boys in the common room. She tells them that she never thought to look inside of it, but after flicking through some pages, she finally comes upon Nicholas Flamel, and it reads off very similarly to what we see in the movie, giving the necessary information to the trio about Flamel's achievement of creating the Sorcerer's Stone. Another small change is that the book gives a little bit more information than what is shown in the movie. Per usual, they keep the movie version to just the pertinent info, but the book shares more about Flamel, saying that he enjoys opera and lives a quiet life in Devon with his wife Perenelle. Okay, so now we come to a change that relates more to a theme or narrative rather than a specific line or action in the movie. I think it is worth noting, however, as the movie doesn't take much time to explore this possibility, which is all about why Snape would want the stone. This is the downside of crunching an entire chapter into just a couple of minutes, as you can't explore these deeper themes. Pretty much what happens in the book is that the trio believes Snape is after the stone for himself, in order to get rich. When learning about the stone, Hermione reads that it can turn anything to gold, whereas in the movie, they put emphasis on the immortality aspect of its abilities. At this point, the idea of Snape using the stone to help Voldemort return isn't at all on their minds. They simply think he's a villain himself looking to get rich off of the stone. Next, let's talk about the Quidditch match. These are some of my favorite parts of the story to cover, but unfortunately, these games are either shortened or just completely removed from the movies. As for this game in particular, it was completely erased, and it has a lot of great moments that impact the story. To start, Harry and Ron are talking about what they would do with all of their money if they had the Sorcerer's Stone, and Ron mentions he would buy a Quidditch team. This reminds Harry about his upcoming match with Snape refereeing, and he informs Ron and Hermione that he does intend to play. If he backs down, he'll be looked at as a coward and be abandoning his team, so in true Gryffindor fashion, he is going to brave the storm and play on. We then learn that in the days leading up to the match, Snape seemed to pop up around Harry all of the time. Whether this is just Harry's imagination, or if Snape was really following him, Harry didn't know. Potions class were torture, as Snape seemed to enjoy making them as horrible as possible for Harry, which made Harry paranoid that Snape knew the trio knew about the Sorcerer's Stone and Snape's plan to get it. Then we get into a very interesting note from Harry, which is that he gets the horrible feeling every once in a while that Snape could read minds. This is a super intriguing line from J.K. Rowling in this book. As we know later on in the series, Snape and Harry have quite an interesting subplot regarding the reading of minds. Next, we finally get to the game itself, and we learn that Harry was so nervous he was barely aware of himself as he prepped for the game in the locker room. Hermione and Ron went to the stands and sat next to Neville, who didn't understand why they brought their wands to the match. Evidently, they had been practicing the leg locker curse just in case they needed to use it on Snape, and they had gotten the idea from Malfoy. But instead of getting into a fight with Snape, they get into a fight with a different set of Slytherins: Malfoy, Crabbe, and Goyle. As the game began, Malfoy poked Ron on the back of the head, and then asked him if he wanted to bet on how long Harry would stay on his broom this game. Although Ron ignored this, Malfoy kept at it, as a minute later he insulted everyone, saying that the Gryffindor team just picks people they feel sorry for to be on the team. Harry has no parents, the Weasley twins have no money, and then he says Neville should get on the team in no time as he has no brains. This time, Malfoy picked the wrong day to mess with Neville, as Neville turned around and shakily informed Malfoy that he's worth 12 of him, quoting Harry from earlier. Ron held it together for a while, but finally snapped after Malfoy took one last jab at him. While Harry dove towards the ground, obviously chasing the snitch, Malfoy said, "You're in luck, Weasley. Potter has obviously spotted some money on the ground." Despite having clear instructions to focus on the game and protect Harry, this final comment broke Ron, and he couldn't help it anymore as he dove onto Malfoy, wrestling him to the ground. Surprisingly, Neville followed suit and dove onto the pile with Crabbe and Goyle. While the boys threw fists on the ground, Hermione was busy celebrating, as at the end of Harry's dive, he came up with the snitch, triumphantly winning the game for Gryffindor in just 5 minutes. But Ron and Neville were too busy fighting to notice. We then hear from Harry's side of things on the ground of the field as Dumbledore came up to him and congratulated him, telling him well done and that he's happy to see Harry hasn't been brooding about the mirror. Lastly, before we get to the final change, I wanted to note the last thing we hear about the fight between the boys, which is at the very end of the chapter. Evidently, Ron gave Malfoy a black eye, and Neville took Crabbe and Goyle on single-handedly. Ron informs Harry that Neville is still out cold, but Madame Pomfrey says he should be alright. I think this part is hilarious, but also endearing at the same time, as we are seeing some foreshadowing of Neville's bravery growing, as he fills in his Gryffindor shoes more and more each week. Now let's go back to the end of the Quidditch match, and talk about the final change for this week. As the game has finished, we read about Harry going to lock up his Nimbus 2000, but something happens which brings us into our next big change. As I mentioned in last week's episode, Snape never confronted Quirrell in the halls after Harry escaped the restricted section, but in the book, this encounter still happens, just in a different way. Here's how things really went down. As Harry is going to lock up his broom, he relives the game over and over in his head, finally feeling proud of himself after his amazing accomplishment of putting Gryffindor in the lead for the House Cup. He recalls the Gryffindors rushing the field, Ron and Hermione cheering him on, and Ron having a heavy nosebleed in the stands after his fight. But Harry's daydreaming is cut short as he looks up at the castle and sees a hooded figure coming down the stairs in the distance. After recognizing that it's Snape, Harry couldn't help himself, and he mounted his broom to sneak after Snape and see where he was going. Eventually, after following him for a bit, Snape went into the Forbidden Forest, and Harry landed on a tree above where Snape was, and to his surprise, he saw that Quirrell was there too. We then hear similar dialogue to what the movie shows, with a few notable additions. Snape mentions that he wanted to meet in the forest because the students aren't supposed to know about the Sorcerer's Stone. Harry also hears Snape ask Quirrell if he's figured out how to get past the dog yet. Then of course we hear the line that is in the movie of Snape telling Quirrell that he needs to decide where his loyalties lie. This version of Snape's confronting Quirrell in the forest makes a lot more sense than the random encounter Harry sees in the halls. First of all, Hogwarts is a massive place, so the sheer odds that Harry would have bumped into this conversation at this precise moment in the film is a little far-fetched. The book, however, is a lot more logical in the sense that Harry saw Snape sneaking out of the castle and then purposefully followed him while on his broom so as not to be seen. The chapter ends on an ominous note as Harry informs Ron and Hermione of his findings during his recon mission, and Ron says that if it's up to Quirrell to stand up to Snape or else the stone gets taken, the stone will be gone by next week. And that is where changes end for this week. Now enough of my input, I want to hear what you think. Do you enjoy the movie's 2-minute version of this chapter, or do you wish they had kept the Quidditch match as well as Snape's original version of confronting Quirrell in the Forbidden Forest? Let me know in the comments below. As always, be sure to like and subscribe if you're new here, and check out the series playlist to catch up on any episodes that you might have missed so far. Have a great week, and I'll see you in the next episode.